I never thought I would hear those words, not from my own daughter. It's fine, just let her sort herself out. That was what she'd said, a dismissive whisper to her husband, as I stood at the departure gate, ticket in hand and my heart, foolishly, full of hope. I had planned this trip, paid for everything, all for a chance to reconnect with the family I thought still cared. But they boarded the plane without me, laughing as if it were all some last-minute inconvenience. What they didn't know was that I was never meant to fly with them. I was about to board my own jet, bound for somewhere far better. I was alone, but finally, I was free. The cavernous hall of Manchester Airport has always felt like a place of profound transition, a grand stage for hellos and goodbyes. Today, however, I was the one being left behind, or so they thought. My daughter, Olivia, turned to me, her face a mask of strained politeness. She asked if I had the passports, her smile as tight and meticulously constructed as the rest of her appearance. She was 41, yet she still wore the same tense expression she used as a teenager whenever my late husband, Robert, and I denied her some fleeting whim. Of course, I replied, my gloved hand patting the inner pocket of my Burberry trench coat. I've always been meticulous with documents, a hard lesson learned from my father, who lost our family home by failing to read the fine print on a contract. The airport was a thrumming hive of activity this Thursday morning. Families wrestled with oversized suitcases, sharp-suited executives typed furiously on laptops, and there we were, the Vance Cromwells, about to embark on a trip to Dubai I had orchestrated for months. It was meant to be a place of healing, a sun-drenched oasis where I hoped to reconnect with my only child now that Robert was gone. My granddaughter, Amelia, walked beside me. Her 13 years a perfect, charming blend of youthful curiosity and burgeoning teenage awkwardness. She asked if I'd ever seen the Burj Khalifa. I smiled, a genuine one this time, the memory warming me against the terminal's conditioned chill. I told her that her grandfather and I had stood on a building site in the desert there, back in the 80s, when it was all just sand and ambition. Robert had declared it would one day be the center of the world, and he was nearly right. He almost lost his hat to a sudden gust of wind, a silly, precious memory. She asked if he caught it, and I laughed, explaining that he hadn't, but he'd bought me a beautiful silk scarf from a local market to make up for it, one I still had. Trevor, my son-in-law, walking ahead with a trolley laden with our designer luggage, let out a barely suppressed snort. He muttered something about stories from the Dark Ages, just loud enough for me to hear. I chose to say nothing. After 40 years of building a property empire alongside Robert, I have perfected the art of strategic silence. Patience, as with property, reveals the true nature of people over time. We reached the gate, just as the first call for our flight to Dubai echoed through the hall. I reached into my handbag for the tickets, but Olivia placed a cool, manicured hand on mine, her nails a shade of aggressive red. She told me not to worry, that she had them all. I nodded, grateful for the small gesture, a flicker of hope that perhaps this trip would indeed bring us closer. The departure lounge was nearly full. I sat with Amelia while Olivia and Trevor spoke in low, urgent tones near the counter. I watched their reflections in the vast window overlooking the tarmac, their furtive glances in my direction, their synchronized nods. Something was wrong. The metallic voice of the announcer cut through my thoughts, beckoning passengers for flight EK018 to Dubai. Amelia jumped up, her eyes bright with excitement, telling me it was time to go. I picked up my small carry-on, I've always preferred to travel light, and joined the queue. Olivia and Trevor rejoined us, their faces etched with attention they were failing to conceal. Olivia placed her hand on my arm, her touch feigning a sympathy that I recognized from 1,000 other minor betrayals. She told me there had been a small problem with my ticket. A problem? I asked, my voice steady, betraying none of the cold dread creeping up my spine. Apparently, the flight was overbooked, she continued, glancing at Trevor, who nodded as if confirming a rehearsed line. And because our tickets were booked in 2 separate transactions, my seat was one of those affected. The chill I felt now had nothing to do with the airport's air conditioning. So, they were saying there was no room for me on the plane. Trevor stepped forward, adopting the condescending tone he reserves for those he considers his inferiors. It happens sometimes, Eleanor, he explained, an airline policy thing. But not to worry, he added, his smile utterly devoid of warmth. I'm sure you'll find your way. The phrase hung in the air between us. Find your way. As if I were a misdirected parcel, an inconvenience, a problem to be solved by someone else. I looked from my daughter to her husband, searching their faces for a single shred of contradiction, of remorse. I found only relief, poorly disguised beneath a thin veneer of concern. I see, was all I said. Olivia launched into a prepared speech about how they could wait for the next flight, but they would lose the hotel reservation, and finding last-minute accommodation in Dubai during the season was so difficult. I stopped listening. In that single, stark moment, everything crystallized. The little humiliations, the patronizing comments, the impatient glances whenever I reminisced about Robert. It wasn't just the disinterest of a grown child towards her aging mother. It was something colder, more calculated. Of course, I replied, with a calmness that surprised even me. You go ahead. Enjoy Dubai. Trevor let out a sigh of almost comical relief. I knew you'd understand, Eleanor. You're a practical woman. Olivia gave me a quick, brittle hug, her expensive perfume cloying and artificial. She promised to call when they landed and to bring me something nice from the souks. Amelia, however, lingered behind as her parents eagerly joined the boarding line. I saw the confusion on her face, the internal struggle. She started to say something, then stopped, unsure. I stroked her cheek, assuring her it was all right, that she should go with her parents. She whispered that it wasn't fair, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the Olivia I once knew, before bitterness and entitlement had taken root. Life rarely is, I told her softly, but we always find our way, don't we? She glanced towards her impatient parents. Then, with a swift movement, she slipped something from her pocket into the pocket of my coat. I love you, Grandma, she whispered. Before running to catch up, I stood there, motionless, as I watched my family disappear down the jet bridge. I could feel the folded paper Amelia had given me, but I didn't take it out. Instead, I sat in one of the now empty seats and watched the aircraft that was supposed to take me to Dubai prepare to leave without me. Only when the enormous plane began to taxi down the runway did I allow myself to retrieve Amelia's note. It was a small piece of paper, folded neatly, her messy, heartfelt script scrawled across it. Asterisk Grandma, I don't know what's happening, but I love you. I don't agree with Mum and Dad. I'll miss you in Dubai. Love, Amelia. Asterisk, a single tear threatened to escape, but I willed it back. I would not cry here, in this public theater where my betrayal had been so openly staged. Instead, I tucked the note back into my pocket, alongside my passport and the platinum card very few people knew I possessed. I stood up with the quiet dignity I had cultivated over decades, took my single case, and began to walk. Not towards the car park as Olivia undoubtedly expected, but towards the discreet private terminal at the far end of the airport. As I walked, I felt a fundamental shift inside me. It wasn't anger, though I had every right to it. It wasn't sadness, though the sting was sharp. It was an awakening. For 40 years, Robert and I had built something extraordinary, from a small terraced house in Salford to a property portfolio now worth hundreds of millions. We always lived modestly, not out of necessity, but by choice. True wealth never needs to shout, Robert used to say. And I, out of love for my daughter, had maintained the facade. I flew commercial when I could have a private jet. I lived in a comfortable but simple manner in the Cotswolds when I could have owned castles. Also, Olivia would never feel overwhelmed by the weight of our fortune. But today, in the simple act of leaving me behind, Olivia had shown me exactly who she was. And I, at 69 years old, finally understood who I needed to be. I arrived at the signature private terminal, and the contrast was immediate. The noisy, chaotic energy of the main airport gave way to a hushed world of polished marble, deep leather armchairs, and the subtle, expensive scent of fresh coffee and quiet power. The staff greeted me by name, their professionalism a soothing balm on the raw wound of my family's betrayal. Good morning, Mrs. Vance Cromwell, The concierge said with a respectful nod. We weren't expecting you today. A last-minute change of plans, I replied, my voice betraying no emotion. Is Captain O'Connell available? He was performing the pre-flight checks, she informed me, but she would call him at once. While I waited in the plush VIP lounge, I watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the commercial flight to Dubai, a behemoth of metal and dashed hopes, finally lifted into the gray Manchester sky. Olivia, Trevor, and Amelia would be settling into their seats, perhaps clinking champagne glasses to celebrate their successful maneuver. They had no idea I was never planning to return from that trip with them. They didn't know that while they basked in the artificial luxury of a hotel suite I had paid for, I would be in my Manhattan penthouse, meeting with my solicitor. They didn't know that the trip they thought they had ruined was merely the opening scene of a drama I was now directing. The sound of polished leather shoes on marble announced his arrival. Eleanor. Liam O'Connell's voice, a soft Irish baritone, cut through my reverie. What a surprise. I thought you'd be on your way to the desert with the family. Liam, 42 and with the roguish good looks of a man who had seen the world, was more than a pilot. Hired by Robert over a decade ago, the former RAF wing commander had become a trusted confidant, one of the very few who knew the true extent of our assets. He stood before me, immaculate in his pilot's uniform, the crisp white shirt and dark tie a stark contrast to his slightly unruly dark hair and eyes the color of aged whiskey. There was a quiet strength about him, a stillness born of discipline and competence that was intensely reassuring. There's been a change of plans, Liam, I said, getting straight to the point. I need to go to New York. Today. Is that possible? He didn't ask why, a quality Robert and I had always valued above all others. Of course, he replied, his gaze steady and searching. The jet is fueled and ready. We can be airborne as soon as you're ready. I indicated my small suitcase. This is all I have. He smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached his eyes. Traveling light as always. For the first time since the incident at the gate, I felt a flicker of warmth, a sense that some small part of my world remained solid and dependable. As I completed the brief paperwork for the transatlantic flight, I took out my phone and dialed a number I seldom used. Evelyn Reed. The voice on the other end was as sharp and precise as a solicitor's letter. Evelyn, it's Eleanor Vance Cromwell. I need to meet you in New York tomorrow. It's about the trust. And my will. I want to make some changes. There was a brief, professional pause. Of course, Mrs. Vance Cromwell. What time would be convenient for you? First thing, I replied. There is a great deal to do and very little time. I'll clear my schedule. My office at 9. She hung up, and I put the phone away. Through the windows of the terminal, I could see our jet, a sleek Gulfstream G650, discreetly marked with the VC Holdings logo, not our family name. The weak English sun glinted off its wings, like a spotlight finding its lead actor. Robert always said that high-stakes property development was a form of theater, all about timing, location, and presentation. It was my turn to write the final acetas. I boarded the jet and settled into a cream leather seat as soft as butter. I felt Amelia's note in my pocket, a fragile reminder that even in the darkest betrayal, a sliver of hope can remain. My granddaughter, at least, had a heart not yet corrupted by greed. Once we were airborne and climbing steeply over the Irish Sea, Liam emerged from the cockpit. The roar of the engines softened to a constant, reassuring hum. New York, then, he said, more a statement than a question as he took the seat opposite me. Yes, Liam. New York. I looked out of the window as the green fields of Ireland gave way to the vast, unforgiving blue of the Atlantic. We're not going to Dubai. My eyes were dry, my silence sharper than any insult I could have hurled. He watched me for a long moment, his whiskey-colored eyes filled with a concern that was both professional and deeply personal. He was one of the few people who had seen Robert and me in our element, who understood the partnership we'd had. Olivia left me at the airport. I stated the word simple, unadorned. She and Trevor concocted a story about the flight being overbooked. Liam's jaw tightened, a subtle clenching of muscle that was the only outward sign of his anger. I'm sorry to hear that, Eleanor. Don't be, I said. It was illuminating. I'm going to restructure everything, Liam. The trust, the properties, the foundation. Robert and I always planned for Olivia to be well taken care of, but I see now that would be a catastrophic mistake. The money would only feed the worst parts of her nature. And what about young Amelia? He asked, his insight as sharp as ever. Amelia will have her own trust, one that Olivia and Trevor can never touch. But she needs time to grow away from their influence. I took out my tablet and opened a secure file, a meticulously detailed list of our entire empire. Properties across 3 continents, shares in dozens of companies, art collections, offshore accounts. An empire built brick by brick, deal by deal, over 4 decades of tireless work. I'm gonna need your help with this, Liam. There are people to see, documents to deliver. You know you can count on me, Eleanor. His loyalty, so freely given, was a stark contrast to the conditional affection of my own daughter. I felt a brief pang of doubt, wondering if Robert would have approved of such a drastic course of action. But I knew the answer. Robert valued integrity above all else. What Olivia had done was a betrayal of that core principle. Thank you, Liam. For now, I just need some time to think. He nodded, understanding the signal, and returned to the cockpit, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the whisper of the jet stream. I closed my eyes, letting the memories flood in. Robert and I, barely 20, buying our first property, a dilapidated terraced house in Salford, with every penny we had and a loan that nearly broke us. We renovated it ourselves, stripping wallpaper on weekends, learning plumbing from library books, our hands raw but our spirits high. When Olivia was born, we owned 3 houses. By the time she was 10, we had a portfolio of 20. We were millionaires several times over before she went to university, but we never changed our lifestyle. A comfortable manor in the Cotswolds, good cars but not flashy ones, business-class flights, all for a reason that now seemed tragically naive. We wanted Olivia to value hard work, to be grounded. Perhaps that was our greatest mistake. Perhaps, as Robert once mused late at night, some people are simply born with a void inside them that no amount of love or money can ever fill. The jet hit a patch of turbulence, a slight shudder that shook me from my reverie. Life had its turbulence, too. For months after Robert's death, my anchor had been the hope of reconnecting with Olivia, a hope that was now receding with every nautical mile we put between us and England. We were flying towards a new reality, one I would have to build alone. The sun set ahead of us, a spectacular blaze of orange and purple across the cloudscape, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the legacy Robert and I had built would not be squandered. It would go to someone who would honor it. As the lights of Long Island began to sparkle in the darkness below, Liam's voice came over the intercom, announcing our descent into New York. My new chapter was about to begin. We landed smoothly at Teterboro, the private airport in New Jersey that serves Manhattan's elite. The transition from air to ground was seamless, a quiet ballet of efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic scrum of commercial travel. A black town car was waiting on the tarmac, its engine purring softly. Liam supervised the transfer of my single case while I stood for a moment, breathing in the cool night air, thick with the scent of rain on hot tarmac and the distant promise of the city. As we crossed the George Washington Bridge, Manhattan unfolded before us, a breathtaking tapestry of light and shadow, a city that had always felt more like a living entity than a place. Robert had loved its brutal honesty. New York, he'd say, doesn't care about your feelings. It only respects your strength. The car wound its way through the canyons of the Upper East Side, the city's symphony of sirens and horns a familiar, strangely comforting soundtrack. I watched Liam's hands on the steering wheel, his knuckles brushing the fine leather. They were capable, steady hands, the hands of a man you could trust to navigate a storm, whether in the sky or on the ground. He glanced at me, his gaze briefly catching mine in the rearview mirror. He asked if I wanted him to just drop me off. I found myself hesitating. The thought of entering the silent apartment alone, with only ghosts for company, was suddenly unbearable. I told him I'd appreciate the company, if he didn't mind. He simply nodded, a silent confirmation that he understood more than I had said. Our penthouse was one of our best-kept secrets, occupying the top 2 floors of a limestone pre-war building overlooking Central Park. Not even Olivia knew of its existence. It was our sanctuary, the one place we could be ourselves, away from the carefully constructed facade of our life in England. As the private lift opened directly into the foyer, the memories hit me with the force of a physical blow. Robert, barefoot, attempting to play a jazz standard on the Steinway grand piano. Robert on the terrace at dawn, a mug of strong coffee in his hand, watching the city wake up. Robert in the library, surrounded by blueprints and contracts, his face alive with the thrill of a new deal. Liam placed my case by the door, his presence a solid, warm anchor in the silent, echoing space. He asked if I was all right. I nodded, forcing myself back to the present. It was just the memories, I told him, finding my voice. The good ones are sometimes the hardest. I walked through to the main living area, the vast space dominated by a wall of glass offering a panoramic view of the park and the glittering skyline beyond. The walls were adorned not with family photos, but with pieces of modern art we had collected over the years. A sharp, angular sculpture by Hepworth, a brooding Rothko, a vibrant Hockney. This was our real home that I went to the bar, a sleek construction of polished mahogany and chrome, and poured myself a small measure of Robert's favorite single malt. The amber liquid swirled in the heavy crystal glass as I walked out onto the terrace. The city air was cool on my face. Below, the lights of cars moved like rivers of fire along Fifth Avenue. In the distance, the Empire State Building stood sentinel, its familiar spire a beacon in the night. Liam appeared at the doorway behind me, holding 2 steaming mugs. "I thought you might prefer this," he said, his voice soft. He'd made tea, English breakfast, just the way I liked it. It was a simple, thoughtful gesture that touched me more than any grand display could have. I took the mug, my fingers brushing his. For a moment, we just stood there in silence. The vast, impersonal city spread out before us, creating a strange bubble of intimacy. I felt his gaze on me, not pitying, but assessing, concerned. He was a man who understood command, and he could see that I was preparing for a battle. I told him about the meeting with Evelyn Reed in the morning. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply said he would have the car ready at 8:30. His quiet confidence was exactly what I needed. After he left for the guest suite, I sat in Robert's leather armchair in the library, the tablet open on my lap, reviewing the architecture of our fortune. The trust was a fortress, designed by Robert and me to be flexible, powerful, and, crucially, under my sole control. As the city that never sleeps hummed around me, I finalized my strategy. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. The next morning I dressed for war. I chose a dark, ink blue silk blouse, tailored black trousers that fell with a satisfying weight, and a pair of sharp, elegant heels. I fastened Robert's Patek Philippe watch around my wrist, its familiar weight a connection to his pragmatism and strength. When I looked in the mirror, I saw not a grieving widow or a spurned mother, but the woman who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Robert Vance Cromwell and built an empire from nothing. When Liam saw me, a flicker of something appreciation, perhaps, crossed his face before being replaced by his usual professional calm. He simply said I looked ready. Evelyn Reed's offices were in a sleek glass tower in Midtown. The space was minimalist and modern, furnished with chrome and black leather, the only color coming from the spectacular views of the Chrysler Building. Evelyn herself was the human embodiment of her office. Sharp, stylish, and radiating an unnerving intelligence. She was dressed in a severe but exquisitely cut gray suit, her silver hair styled in a sharp bob. She greeted me with a firm handshake, her eyes missing nothing. She told me she was sorry for the circumstances but was ready to proceed. Liam had waited in the reception, giving us the privacy this conversation demanded. I sat opposite her at a vast glass desk and got straight to the point. I laid out my plan with the same dispassionate precision I would use when outlining a major property acquisition. I told her I wanted Olivia removed as the primary beneficiary of the Vance Cromwell Trust. In its place, I wanted to establish a new charitable entity, the Vance Cromwell Foundation for Urban Renewal. Evelyn took notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen scratching softly in the quiet room. She asked who would run this new foundation. I gave her the name of a brilliant, fiercely idealistic architect we had mentored years ago, a man named Dr. Eris Thorne. He would understand the mission. Next, Amelia. I instructed Evelyn to create a separate, ironclad educational and personal trust for her, to be managed by a neutral third party. It would become accessible to her on her 25th birthday, along with a personal letter from me explaining my reasons. Evelyn looked up from her notes. And what provision, if any, for Olivia? I considered it for a moment. Despite everything, she was still my daughter. The child whose tears I had dried, whose triumphs I had celebrated. I told Evelyn to arrange a modest annuity, paid monthly. Enough for a comfortable life if she was careful. Not enough for designer handbags and luxury holidays. It was a pension, not a prize. Finally, I instructed her to begin the process of selling the Cotswolds Manor and our London flat. The proceeds were to be the initial endowment for the new foundation. For 3 hours we worked, refining clauses, closing loopholes, ensuring my intentions were legally unassailable. When it was done, and I had signed the preliminary documents, a profound sense of finality settled over me. As I stood to leave, I gave Evelyn one last instruction. I wanted the official notifications sent to Olivia and Trevor via courier on Friday morning. By then, they would be back from Dubai, tanned and smug. I wanted them to be together when the news landed. As Liam and I descended in the silent, wood-paneled lift, he didn't ask how it went. He didn't need to. He simply placed a steadying hand on the small of my back as we stepped out into the bustling New York street. It was a fleeting, professional gesture, yet it felt like an anchor in a world that had been tilting on its axis. The first part of my plan was complete. The bomb had been built and the timer set. Now all I had to do was wait for it to detonate. The days that followed were a strange, suspended period of calm before the inevitable storm. I remained in New York, using the penthouse as my command center. This city, with its relentless forward momentum, was the perfect place to sever ties with the past. There was no room for sentimentality here, only for action. I spent my time methodically tying up loose ends. I spoke with Dr. Eris Thorne, the architect I had chosen to head the new foundation. He was a visionary, a man who saw buildings not just as structures of concrete and steel, but as vessels for community and hope. When I explained what I was doing, he was silent for a long moment, overwhelmed. Then, with a voice thick with emotion, he accepted, promising to honor the trust one had placed in him. I knew with absolute certainty that Robert's and my legacy would be safe in his hands. Liam remained my steadfast shadow, a silent, reassuring presence. He ferried me to meetings, managed my security, and, in the quiet evenings, would often join me for tea on the terrace. We rarely spoke of what was to come. Instead, we talked about art, about architecture, about the changing face of the cities we flew between. He had a keen eye and a dry wit that I found myself appreciating more and more. He told me stories of his time in the RAF, of flying missions over landscapes as beautiful as they were dangerous. In his quiet, understated way, he was reminding me that there was a world beyond the confines of my family drama. A world of courage, duty, and quiet honor. One afternoon, he found me in the library, staring at a framed photograph on the desk. It was the only personal photo in the apartment, taken on our 20th anniversary. Robert and I were on a beach in the Maldives, laughing, our faces tanned, our hair tousled by the wind. We looked young, invincible, utterly unaware of the fault lines that were already forming beneath the surface of our perfect life. He remarked that we looked happy. I agreed, but confessed that I was beginning to realize that happiness is a more complicated thing than a photograph can ever capture. I told him about our early years, the struggle, the shared dream. I spoke of Olivia's birth, the fierce, overwhelming love I had felt, a love that had, perhaps, blinded me to the person she was becoming. He listened without interruption, his gaze steady, his silence a vessel for my words. When I finished, he didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply said that Robert had been a lucky man. The words, spoken in his soft Irish brogue, were simple, yet they landed with a profound weight. Friday morning arrived, crisp and clear. I woke early and stood on the terrace, watching the sun rise over Central Park. In England, it was already midday. The courier would be arriving at the manor in the Cotswolds. I could picture the scene with perfect clarity. Olivia and Trevor, relaxed after their trip, perhaps enjoying coffee in the conservatory. Their conversation peppered with complaints about the flight and boasts about the hotel. Then the doorbell. The arrival of a sleek, professional courier with a legal document wallet. Trevor, ever the master of the house, would sign for it, his expression one of mild curiosity. Olivia would be impatient, wanting to know what it was. They would open it together. I imagined the slow dawning of confusion, followed by disbelief, and finally, the volcanic eruption of pure, unadulterated rage. My phone remained silent. I had instructed Evelyn Reed that all communication was to go through her. I would not allow myself to be drawn into a shouting match. My war would be fought with the cold, hard precision of legal documents, not the messy chaos of emotion. Around noon, New York time, Liam entered the living room. "Evelyn Reed is on the line for you," he said, holding out the secure satellite phone we used for sensitive communications. I took a deep breath and took the call. "The storm has made landfall," Evelyn said, her voice calm and professional. "Mr. and Mrs. Davies are displeased." A masterful understatement. I could hear a man shouting in the background of the call. Trevor. Undoubtedly, his voice a furious, impotent roar. Olivia had apparently collapsed into hysterics. Their solicitor was threatening injunctions, lawsuits, a declaration of incompetence. "Let them threaten," I replied, my own voice a cool counterpoint to the chaos on the other end of the line. "We are on solid ground, Evelyn. They have no legal standing." She agreed, and we spent the next 10 minutes discussing our counter-strategy. When I hung up, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a play unfold from a great distance. Liam was standing by the window, his back to me. He asked if everything was as I expected. I told him it was exactly. He turned then, his expression unreadable. "And how do you feel?" he asked, his gaze searching mine. For a moment, I considered giving him the expected answer, that I felt vindicated, that I felt free. But his quiet sincerity demanded honesty. "I feel empty," I confessed, like a surgeon who has just completed a difficult but necessary amputation. "There is no joy in it, only a quiet, hollow relief." The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and emails between my legal team in New York and London. Trevor's blustering threats quickly subsided when his own solicitor, a man more interested in billable hours than lost causes, explained the ironclad nature of the documents. The anger then turned to pleading. My phone lit up with a barrage of texts from Olivia. They were a pathetic, desperate scroll of emotions. First came the outrage, the accusations of cruelty and madness. Then came the tearful apologies, the sudden, convenient memories of a happy childhood. She wrote of her love for me, her regret, her promise to be a better daughter. Each message was a transparent, clumsy attempt at manipulation. I read them all, then deleted them without replying. The Olivia who wrote those messages was a stranger to me, a fiction created out of panic. Later that evening, a call came through from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. It was Amelia. Her voice was small, frightened. "Grandma," she said, "Mom and Dad they're fighting. Dad is breaking things. Mom is crying. She says you've ruined us. I don't understand what's happening. Please, call me." My heart constricted. This was the one thing I had feared, the collateral damage. I had tried to shield Amelia, but I had underestimated the toxicity of her parents' reaction. I immediately called her back. Her voice was a choked whisper. I told her, as calmly as I could, that this was an adult disagreement about business, and that it had nothing to do with her. I told her that I loved her, that she was safe, and that no matter what happened between the adults, my love for her would never change. I promised her that I would see her soon, that we would sort everything out. When I hung up, my carefully constructed composure crumbled. The emptiness I had felt earlier was replaced by a wave of guilt. Liam, who had entered the room silently, came and stood beside me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of simple, human comfort. "You did what you had to do, Eleanor," he said softly. "You cannot protect her from their behavior. You can only give her a safe place to land. And you have." I knew he was right, but the sound of my granddaughter's fear would haunt my sleep that night. The battle was won, but the war, I realized, was far from over. I had severed the financial ties, but the emotional ones were a tangled, messy knot that would not be so easily undone. And as I looked out at the indifferent lights of the city, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. I had set a fire to burn away the corruption in my family, but I had to make sure that my granddaughter, the only innocent in this sorry affair, didn't get burned in the process. The following week was a war of attrition, fought not on a battlefield but through a relentless barrage of solicitors' letters, frantic phone calls from third parties, and the cloying, passive-aggressive silence of my daughter. Olivia, having realized that her emotional appeals were futile, had retreated into a state of wounded martyrdom. She began communicating through mutual acquaintances, painting a picture of a frail, confused mother being manipulated by shadowy forces. It was a pathetic and predictable strategy, but it was causing ripples in the small, insular world of the English upper class we inhabited. Old friends called, their voices thick with false concern, offering to mediate. I politely but firmly shut them down. Liam became my gatekeeper, his calm authority an impenetrable shield against the well-meaning but ultimately intrusive inquiries. He screened my calls, managed my diary, and created a bubble of tranquility around me that allowed me to focus on the future I was trying to build. One evening, as we were sharing a quiet dinner in the penthouse, a simple meal of grilled sea bass and asparagus that Liam had insisted on cooking himself, he handed me a tablet. "I've been monitoring their financials," he said, his tone neutral. "It's not looking good for them." The screen showed a summary of Trevor's business dealings. His investment firm was little more than a house of cards, propped up by the expectation of Olivia's inheritance. He had leveraged my name and our family's reputation to secure loans he had no realistic way of repaying. Without the safety net of my fortune, he was financially exposed, teetering on the edge of ruin. And he had dragged Olivia down with him. They had mortgaged the manor to the hilt, living a life of extravagant illusion. I felt a cold knot of pity tighten in my stomach. Not for Trevor. He was a fool and a charlatan who was getting what he deserved. But for Olivia, she had hitched her wagon to a failing star, blinded by his superficial charm and her own desperate need for a lifestyle she felt she was owed. I said, looking up from the damning figures. Robert saw this coming. He tried to warn her about Trevor years ago. He said the man was all polish and no substance. Liam nodded, his expression grim. "Some people have to learn by touching the fire." "The problem," I said, my thoughts turning once again to my granddaughter, "is that they're going to get Amelia burned in the process." That night, I made a decision. The defensive phase was over. It was time to go on the offensive, not to punish, but to protect. The next morning, I instructed Evelyn Reed to begin legal proceedings to gain temporary guardianship of Amelia, citing the increasingly volatile and unstable environment her parents were creating. It was an extreme measure, a declaration of total war, but the sound of Amelia's frightened voice on the phone had convinced me it was necessary. The legal battle that ensued was brutal and ugly. Olivia and Trevor, now fighting for their parental rights, came out swinging. They hired a notoriously aggressive London barrister who painted me in court as a vindictive, controlling matriarch suffering from grief-induced dementia. My entire life, my motives, my relationship with Robert, everything was picked apart and twisted into something ugly. They accused me of trying to buy my granddaughter's affection. They even stooped so low as to suggest that my relationship with Liam was inappropriate. A desperate, baseless smear designed to muddy the waters. Through it all, Liam was my rock. He sat behind me in court every day, his presence a silent testament to his loyalty. He never flinched, even when the opposing barrister directed his venomous attacks at him. His composure was unshakable, a stark contrast to Trevor's increasingly frantic and sweaty performances in the witness box. The strain was immense. I ate little, slept less, The penthouse, once a sanctuary, started to feel like a gilded cage. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day in a stuffy London courtroom we had flown back for, I broke down. The relentless character assassination, the public airing of our family's dysfunction. It was all too much. I sat in Robert's armchair, the city lights blurring through my tears, and confessed to Liam that I was afraid I had made a terrible mistake. He came and knelt before me, taking my hands in his. His touch was firm, grounding. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and intense, "you are one of the strongest people I have ever known. You built an empire with your husband. You are fighting for your granddaughter's future. Do not let these vipers make you doubt yourself." Looking into his steady, whiskey-colored eyes, I saw not a pilot, not an employee, but a friend, an ally. In that moment, something shifted between us. A line was crossed, not in a physical sense, but in the deeper, more significant landscape of the heart. The professional boundaries that had defined our relationship dissolved, replaced by a current of raw, unspoken emotion. The court case reached its climax. The judge, a stern, intelligent woman with eyes that missed nothing, listened patiently to both sides. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke simply and honestly. I did not raise my voice. I did not resort to accusations. I laid out the facts of my daughter's behavior, the financial recklessness of her husband, and my profound and genuine concern for my granddaughter's well-being. I ended by reading Amelia's note, the one she had slipped into my pocket at the airport. Her small, heartfelt words filled the silent courtroom, a child's simple truth cutting through the complex lies of the adults. Then, the judge delivered her verdict. She granted me temporary custody of Amelia, effective immediately. She was scathing in her assessment of Trevor and Olivia, citing their financial irresponsibility and the emotional turmoil they had subjected their daughter to. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees washed over me. We had won. That evening, back in the New York penthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Amelia was due to arrive the next day, flying over with a court-appointed social worker. We had done it. Liam opened a bottle of vintage champagne that had been chilling in the fridge, a bottle Robert and I had been saving for a special occasion. "This feels like one," Liam said, his eyes sparkling as he handed me a glass. We stood on the terrace, the city spread out at our feet like a carpet of jewels. As we clinked our glasses together, the sound seemed to hang in the night air. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice soft. I looked at him, at this man who had stood by me through the darkest period of my life, who had been my shield and my confidant. The gratitude I felt was immense, but it was tangled with something else, something deeper and more powerful that I was not yet ready to name. I reached out and placed my hand on his arm. "Thank you, Liam," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "for everything." He covered my hand with his own, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through me. "There's no need to thank me, Eleanor. It was a privilege." We stood there for a long moment, the silence between us charged with unspoken possibilities. The city lights blurred as I looked up at him, and I knew, with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty, that the end of one story was simply the beginning of another. But as I leaned in, drawn by a force I no longer had the will to resist, my phone buzzed on the table beside us. It was a text from an unknown number. I glanced at it, my brow furrowing in confusion. The message was short, cryptic, and it sent a sliver of ice through my veins. It contained just a string of coordinates and a single, chilling sentence. Asterisk, he wasn't the man you thought he was. Your husband's real legacy isn't in buildings. Asterisk.